to welcome each and every one of you this evening, and certainly on behalf of myself, Bob Ives, and on behalf of the Old Bristol Historical Society, I'd like to not only welcome you, but thank you all very much for coming to this the first talk in our series in 2024, and there will be 5 talks, but we're so honored to have Belinda with us for our lead-off talk. And fortunately, she'll be doing what she has done on a regular basis. Is this the 4th or 5th year?
Yeah.
Down memory lane. So Belinda has been so willing to research these different kinds of talks from postcards and pictures. But tonight, we're very privileged to hear one about the Pemaquid Messenger. Again, the newspaper that ran in Bristol in the 19th century from 1886 to 1897. 11 full years of history, and Belinda will give us a snapshot review of all of it. And then she needs no introduction whatsoever, but I'm going to introduce her anyways. Belinda is a native daughter of Bristol, Maine, going to Bristol Elementary School, Lincoln Academy, on to Bates College for a BA there, and then on to Boston College for a master's degree in classics and Latin, and then further at the University of North Carolina, where she does further graduate work and becomes the adjunct professor at the University of Southern Maine. Sadly, for some reason, they canceled that department. My daughter first went to Lincoln Academy. She went the year they canceled Latin. Nancy, how could they do that? I mean, it was just terrible. In any event, the department was, so Belinda moved over into her father's lovely business, running harbor-side cabins on the north side of New Harbor. But Belinda does everything for OBHS as well. She's an inspiration and just does so many different things. Co-president with Chuck for 4 years of OBHS, has led so many different committees from education to nominations to, again, our secretary for 5 years. But over and above it all, for me, she is the heart and soul of the Bristol History Center. She watched over the whole rebuilding of that Bristol History Center, from the archival vault to the reading room to all the exhibits that Chuck and she put on. So we are forever grateful to Belinda and Chuck, of course, as well. But Belinda's right there in every junction. So Belinda, on behalf of me and everyone, thank you for all you do.
Wow. Thank you so much, Bobby. I think I'm red in the face. And thank you to everyone here for coming tonight. I feel like I need to say up front that this is going to be an old-fashioned talk. I'm going to be reading my talk, and hopefully there'll be time for questions and comments afterwards. If you've been to my talks, you know I generally like to be more interactive with the audience, but with the Messenger, there's just so much to say that I felt I had to go to a more efficient format. Okay. So anyway, for the past few years, I've been giving a talk that highlights something that we hold in the OBHS collection. This year, I'm excited to share with you one of the most important primary sources that we have for the late 1800s, 156 issues of the Pemaquid Messenger, the only newspaper ever printed in Bristol, published between the years 1886 and 1897. For about the past year and a half, I've been almost obsessed with this paper, reading not only the copies found in our own collection, but also visiting the Maine Historical Society in Portland, where an additional 306 copies can be found. Tonight, I'll be able to share only a little bit of what I've read, and it pains me to have to leave out so much that is interesting. But I hope the talk will be enough to give you a good understanding about how important this resource is and how grateful the OBHS is to have at least a small portion of its run in our collection. As always, I like to give my audience a quick rundown of how the talk is going to be organized. This wasn't what I meant to have up there, but at any rate, the beginning, the beginning is just the beginning of the newspaper. Then I'm going to go into sort of the general nature of the paper and some of the contents of the paper, local issues of the day. And then finally, I will talk about why the Messenger failed. Let's see. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw a great proliferation of newspapers being established. There were many factors contributing to this, but two of the most important were the perfecting of the process in the 1860s to make cheap newsprint out of wood pulp instead of out of more costly cotton rags. And secondly, the technological advances in the printing press itself, which allowed for larger circulations and potentially greater profits. As you can see in this slide, even Lincoln County saw a relatively large number of newspapers being started in the 1800s, though some failed after only a brief time. The first issue of the Pemaquid Messenger was published on June 1st, 1886, under the name B.T. Cox. Benjamin Cox, this is the Boothbay Register, not the Messenger, but Benjamin Cox grew up in Pennsylvania, part of a large Quaker family, and prior to moving to the area, had lived with his physician wife and young son in New Hampshire, working as a printer. After divorcing, his wife moved with the couple's son to Iowa, where she had a brother, while Benjamin moved to Boothbay, undoubtedly enticed there by some Cox relatives, a name that was quite common in the Boothbay area at that time. There, in 1876, Cox founded the Boothbay Register, and 10 years later, when the Messenger was first published under his name, he was still struggling to make a success of the Register. So why start another newspaper? It seems that the actual motivation behind starting the Messenger came not from B.T. Cox, but from another man, W.E. Lewis, who suddenly took over the paper just 4 issues into its printing, and who would continue to run it for the rest of its 11-year run. Some of you may already know who W.E. Lewis was, but others will be surprised to learn that William Lewis was just a young 25-year-old Bristol native married with an infant son. William grew up in Pemaquid Falls, very near the site where he later built the Messenger office. He was the son of Allen Lewis and Helen Fawcett, and grew up surrounded not only by his Lewis relatives, but also by his many Fawcett relatives, including his grandparents, William and Eliza Fawcett, he was probably named after his grandfather, his uncles, Arid and Augustus Fawcett, his aunt, Lizzie Fawcett Wentworth, frequently referred to in the Messenger as Mrs. Wentworth, and all his many other Fawcett relatives. For those of you who may not know the Fawcett name, which is still common in the area, the Fawcetts were among the first European families to settle in Bristol. In 1883, at age 21, William married Emma McCown, a native of Boothbay. In 1885, at age 24, William purchased the former home of Nathaniel Gamage, which the 1887 map shows located at the corner of Harrington Road and the Pemaquid Harbor Road. I assume this must be the same house that's now occupied by Rachel Fawcett. By then, the couple was expecting the second of 9 children eventually born to them. So we can imagine that at age 25, William was looking for a career to support his growing family, and one that matched his talents and abilities. From his first editorial in issue number 4 of the Messenger, it becomes clear that establishing the Messenger and eventually becoming its editor was his plan all along. The catch, you see, was that being young, William Lewis had basically little or no experience running a newspaper, but he was determined to learn. I'd like to read the first couple paragraphs from William's debut editorial. emphasizing a few of the words that he uses and from which we can reconstruct his original plan. Note that he uses the editorial we. We fear we'll be fully as short and as awkward as a schoolboy when he comes forward to speak his first piece in public. Editing a newspaper is a new as well as an unexpected departure for us. When we conceived the idea of publishing a paper in Bristol, we did not expect to be placed so soon at the head of it, but rather proposed to commence at the foot of the ladder and work up. But fate has ordered it differently, and we find ourselves obliged at once to assume the responsibility. But we trust that so sudden an elevation from the rank of a mere local news scribbler to the dignity of editor will not turn our head or confuse us, so that we shall not be able to do justice to our patrons and to ourselves. The editorial goes on to state William's position that the Messenger is to be an independent newspaper and not committed to one political or religious viewpoint. Interestingly enough, he also comments on the paper's location in Pemaquid Falls, making it clear that his top concern is to promote the interests of the whole town and not just the interests of one village over the other. So, in his first editorial, William tells us not only that it was his idea to start the Messenger, but also that he apparently had a plan worked out with Benjamin Cox to first learn the trade by working under his wing, starting out as a local correspondent until such a time as he was ready to take over the paper and move it to Bristol. But apparently, after publishing just 3 issues of the Messenger, Cox changed his mind and speeded up the timeline, suddenly handing over the editorship to Lewis. What I imagine, and what seems logical, is that editing 2 newspapers turned out to be much more work than Cox anticipated. At any rate, instead of having the time he'd planned to learn the trade and ease into the newspaper business, William Lewis was, as he says, suddenly and unexpectedly thrown into this new role. But he was more ready than he thought. As we shall see, over the course of the next 11 years, William Lewis not only ran the newspaper, but became one of the most important and active promoters of the town at a time when its residents were struggling to find new ways to make money. And he did this not only through the pages of his paper, but through his many activities outside the paper as well. In mid-July, just a few weeks after the first issue of the Messenger was published under B.T. Cox, William Lewis and his mother bought what is referred to as the Messenger lot on the Fir Hollow Road, just off Harrington Road, right across from his grandfather Fawcett's home. Whether William had intended to buy a property for an office so soon, or whether this purchase was precipitated by Cox getting cold feet, I don't know. But together, he and his mother bought the lot from their Green Law neighbors for $25, and then immediately mortgaged it to another neighbor for $168, presumably for cash to get started with. The Messenger office went up quickly within just a few weeks. This is part of a photo taken much later that I've cropped to show the area of the original one-story building. By August 4, he tells us that there were 6 people already working at the Messenger, and that the very first items printed in the office were programs for an upcoming concert. Naturally, the most interesting and valuable part of the Messenger for us today lies in its local content. However, I don't want to begin by giving you the impression that the Messenger contained items relevant only to Bristol or to other towns in Lincoln County, like the Lincoln County News does today. Of the 8 pages comprising an issue of the Messenger, only 2 pages were dedicated to local news, with occasional articles printed on other pages. There was 1 page from each of the Bristol Village correspondents and 1 page for correspondence from other Lincoln County towns. The other 6 pages of the paper contained a variety of items, such as news from Augusta and other parts of Maine, news from Washington, D.C. and from Boston, religious sermons, all sorts of human interest stories from all around the world, travel logs, a ladies' page filled with fashion and homemaking articles, works of poetry and fiction, and of course, advertisements for businesses, some located as far away as Chicago. But of course, it's the local issues and the window into the daily lives of people living in town that really capture our attention. I have to admit that it was fun reading through the local columns and occasionally finding a reference to one of my own ancestors. For example, I read in one issue that my great-great-grandfather, Sam Tarr, once grew a huge strawberry that was actually 9 berries grown together. The editor commented that it was about a quart-sized berry. The columns are filled with little stories and tidbits like this. We also learn a lot about the social life of the times and how people kept themselves entertained before television and even before radios came on the scene. There's a lot of visiting going on, and the village correspondence columns are full of reports of people visiting neighbors, friends, and relatives, whether going just down the road, over to another village, or out of town. In the summer, we hear about picnics, outings to Pemaquid Point, baseball games between the villages, horse racing on Pemaquid Beach or at Round Pond's Ocean View Park, and the occasional boxing match. In winter, we hear about horse trots on Boyd's Pond, good sledding conditions, ice fishing, and lots of hunting. And throughout the year, we hear about dances accompanied by local bands, plays put on by local folk, church sociables, and school programs. And there's also a constant parade of lecturers and entertainers coming to Bristol from out of town. In the paper, there's also sometimes a lot of humor. Here's one of my favorite stories as relayed by Gladys Lewis, who wrote an article for the Lincoln County News about the Messenger. She wrote, "Local news was the most important, as evidenced by the fact that the editor wrote to one of his correspondents and made note of the fact that in reporting an accident, no names of the victim were given. People like to see their names in the paper," he wrote. "Be sure to tell who they are next time." The next week, a detailed report came. Had a bad thunderstorm, and 3 cows were killed by lightning. Bessie, Buttercup, and Jessie. I previously mentioned that the paper also contained poetry, some written specifically for the Messenger, and many of them quite humorous. I've seen poems about pogie fishing, playing checkers at Than Hannah's store, and a number of poems about the natural beauty of our coastline. Though somewhat long, I just can't help sharing one of those poems, written in 1886. It was written in response to a previously published poem about the ruins at the fort area and captures what it was like for one young man growing up in Pemaquid Harbor. The partridge farm that he mentions is, of course, what we today call the Fort House. The harbor is New Harbor, and the pond is Round Pond. You may want to just sit back and close your eyes, because it's a pretty visual poem. He who sung of the river of old Pemaquid sung in strains sweet, pathetic, and true. I agree with his muse. I endorse all his views. I declare them my sentiments too. But I have a ditty that I wish to sing. I've some rhymes that I want to report. With a quill I have plucked from Pegasus' wing, let me tune up old Pemaquid Fort. When I was an urchin, not more than so high, and was bent on a day's jolly sport, the falls, nor the point, nor the harbor could vie with the fun to be had at the fort. There I took a trip on the dark rolling tide in a crazy and leaky old float. It belonged to some swain from the river's west side who was courting at Pemaquid Fort. There I went to pick berries to make into sass. For the biggest and thickest I sought, till Squire Partridge's voice, "Get out of my grass," made me beat quick retreat from the fort. When a storm from the south made breakers run high, how we young ones would prance and cavort, till drenched to the skin our linen we'd dry on the sands of old Pemaquid Fort. When the tide going out or the tide coming in? No difference it made with our sport. Stripped clear to the skin, we'd go in for a swim in the creek at old Pemaquid Fort. We were innocent then, not great wicked men, and of sexes we had not a thought. So where was the sin if the girls too went in for a swim with the boys at the fort? Since then, I've seen scores of big Adams and Eves, void of shame in the water's disport. That the fashion was set, I can hardly believe, by the cherubs at Pemaquid Fort. The girls at the harbor and pond and the mills, all were sweet and enticing to court. Those at Pemaquid Falls, too, were winsome and tall, but my choice, it fell nearer the fort. I remember the huskings in Partridge's barn, a hunting red ears was rare sport, but to urchins like me, the best part of the bee was the feast in the house at the fort. At huskings and raisings in those balmy days, the older ones often got taught, but heaven be praised, good corn was not raised for such use at old Pemaquid Fort. When all meet their fate at old St. Peter's Gate, where the red ears and white ones we sort, no doubt there'll be nubbins to roast on the grate, as well as good corn from the fort. If there was no Sheol, Neil Dow, or Maine law, though I'd hate to thus punish my throat, I'd be tempted to drink, and that too without straw, success to old Pemaquid Fort. A score or more stanzas belong to this song, but the muse will not stand my rude court. These unwritten verses are all sweet and strong, and they're all about Pemaquid Fort. Well, I'll take another drink of water. But apart from humor and poetry, there are a number of serious topics that can be explored using the messenger as a primary source. One is how common serious accidents and close calls were, and how limited medicine was at the time. Here are just two accounts of the almost weekly reports of someone getting injured or having a close brush with death. The first concerns a child in a sliding accident. Note that coasting is the word used for sliding. The first coasting accident of the winter took place Thursday forenoon when Frank Day, son of David E. Day, was thrown against a post and rendered unconscious, remaining in this condition till early evening. Dr. Miller attended the case. No serious result will follow, it is thought by the physician. Of course, all that could be done at the time was to wait for the boy to wake up or not wake up. And certainly, if there had been a brain bleed, this report would have been quite different. The second involves a man working in the woods and a premonition that probably saved his life. Thomas H. Fawcett came near bleeding to death last week from a cut on his hand received while chopping in the woods. He managed to get from the woods to his own door when he fainted and fell. His wife, after great exertions, succeeded in checking the flow of blood, which was very great, owing to an artery being severed. One singular thing about the accident was that Mr. Fawcett had, previous to that day, been crossing a stream to reach the place where he was chopping by crawling across on a log. But that particular morning, for some reason, he stopped and built a small bridge before going to his work. Had he not done this, he would probably have bled to death before he could have reached home. Well, we could spend an entire talk focusing on just topics of social history, but I want to turn now to issues surrounding Bristol's economy. During the years that the Messenger was published, Bristol was searching desperately for new industries to replace the declining or failed industries of the past, such as pogie fishing and the granite industry. There were fewer jobs in town for young people, and many of Bristol residents felt compelled to go out of town for jobs in factories elsewhere. Bristol's population was beginning to decline, and it was truly a crisis. You heard in William Lewis's debut editorial that one of his main goals for the Messenger was to promote the interests of Bristol. And indeed, William Lewis becomes one of the most hardworking promoters to create new industry in town. In a minute, I'll talk about the brand new idea of developing tourism, which we know became successful. But at the time, there were many who were skeptical about how much money tourism could actually bring in, and argued that what the town really needed was manufacturing. In the pages of the Messenger, we hear about a number of attempts to bring new manufacturing jobs to town. In January 1887, we hear the suggestion of attracting a corn canning factory to town. By August, the idea had really taken off. The editor writes, "We are in correspondence with several firms and will agree to find one to locate here. If you, as farmers and citizens who are interested in seeing business started, will do your part." He then asked farmers to commit in writing to planting 1.5 to 3 acres in corn. By the end of the month, a number of farmers have agreed to do so and are willing to sign a contract. By September 14th, William announces that a corn canning factory is a sure thing, and even names the company that is coming to town, the Piper Packing Company. He says he's hopeful that they will be at the Bristol Fair that week to meet with the farmers. However, we learn in the September 21st issue that the company wasn't able to make it to the fair, but Lewis says not to despair. He assures them that the company will be here as soon as their canning factory closes for the season. Unfortunately, that's the last mention of the Piper Packing Company, one of the many disappointments that take place during this period. A few weeks later, in 1887, Lewis tells us about the possibility of a shoe factory locating in town. Quote, "One of the directors of the shoe factory visited the place last week and looked over the location. He was well satisfied with the place, and the matter was laid before the directors this week to decide between this town and others that are offering liberal inducements." Unfortunately, the following week, we learned the disappointing news that the Littlefield Shoe Company passed on Bristol and chose to locate in Randolph instead. Following upon these and other disappointments, towards the end of 1888, there are multiple calls to form a local board of trade in order to pursue new industries in a more organized way. Here's a call for citizens to come to a meeting to organize the board. I'd like to read an excerpt from Lewis's editorial that same week, basically urging people to stop being naysayers and to get off their butts and do something. In another column will be found the call for a meeting of our citizens to effect the organization in this town. Though great results may not be accomplished, good results can. Though a cotton factory employing 500 hands may not be built and operated in our midst, a small establishment of some kind that will give work to 15 or 20 young men and women can. Though we may not see a city or a large village spring up around us, we can, by a little effort, improve what we have, help to hold our population, to reduce our taxes, and better than all, give the name to our town and her people of having energy and enterprise enough to try and do something. That's just a little bit. It was a long editorial. In February of '89, the Board of Trade was officially organized, with William Lewis serving as secretary. By April, the board is promoting the establishment of 2 new industries for Bristol. The first was urging the farmers to invest in dairy farming in order to establish a creamery in town. We learned that the board began by forming a committee to canvass the farmers and see if they would commit to increasing their stock of cows. We also learned that farmers pledged around 300 cows to the effort, but that was only half the number needed for a profitable creamery. At that point, we learned that, quote, Mr. Alvin A. Fawcett offered to be one of 5, that is, if you could find the other 4, to hire the money and push the enterprise, but only 1 or 2 had the courage to offer to join him. Too much cold water had been thrown, and so another effort to establish something in Bristol met its doom. The second project promoted by the board was the establishment of a new stock company, a clothing factory in Round Pond. We first hear of the idea in April '89. It's reported that Captain W.M. Fawcett had offered his building free of charge for a year, and that the cost of a share had been set at $5. It was anticipated that the company would start out with 15 workers, but that number would be increased to around 50. By February of the following year, it's reported that the company was turning out 75 to 100 pairs of pants a day, and that the girls working there were earning good wages of over $1 a day. By the end of March, it's stated that the Round Pond clothing factory had turned out over 6,000 pairs of pants so far. We hear of only one problem, which is a familiar one today: the difficulty of finding housing for those who would like to work there. It's apparently also a problem for the granite company run by Mr. Couch. The Round Pond correspondent writes, "There is a grand opportunity for some enterprising person to open a boarding house here. Mr. Couch says that he would have more men come at once, could he find accommodations for them. The girls, also in the factory, have great trouble in finding boarding places, and thus we are stopping many from coming into our village." Forming a board of trade was a great idea, but unfortunately, after an enthusiastic start, it quickly lost steam. After only 2 years of trying to promote new businesses, the board was eventually referred to in the Messenger as deceased. But now to the idea of promoting tourism as a possible new industry to pursue. As I'm sure you know, it was during this period when a new type of tourism was developing. Instead of only the wealthy retreating to places like Newport or Bar Harbor, a new class of vacationer arose. That is, the families of working professionals such as teachers, lawyers, and bankers. And so there was a rush all over the country to create destinations for these people to visit. In 1886, Bristol had a number of small boarding houses, but if it wanted to attract more summer visitors, it needed to build hotels. In the very first issue published under William Lewis in 1886, the New Harbor correspondent reports the following. Captain Edward Penniman of Cape Cod, who has been visiting his brother, went to Bar Harbor last week and returned. He is reported as saying that, quote, New Harbor is a prettier place by all odds. The correspondent goes on to say, and what New Harbor wants is a good hotel, and the man who starts this business first will be the one to make the money. Time permits only a brief look at some of the successes and disappointments in developing tourism during these years, but I hope it's enough to give you a feel for the energy and optimism that this possibility gave the townspeople. Of course, there were some who thought it would all amount to nothing, but they turned out to be wrong. From the beginning of the paper, we see columns boasting about Bristol's potential to develop into a popular summer resort. But in addition to the stunning beauty of the area, it was argued that Pemaquid had one other thing that other places didn't have. The unique historical significance of colonial Pemaquid, which local figures like John Henry Cartland and members of the Maine Historical Society were working hard to promote. As things got started, local investors and businessmen approached the challenge from two different angles. One way was to divide up one's land into small lots and try to induce people from away to buy property and build summer cottages. This would bring more people into the town during the summer, help reduce taxes, and create a lot of work for local carpenters, cooks, cleaners, store owners, and other tradespeople. It's hard to imagine this now, but it actually took some work to entice people to come here and buy a cottage lot. In July 1887, the paper tells us that Captain C.A. Sproul, in an attempt to attract buyers, actually offered to give away for free 5 waterfront lots of each party's choosing, as long as they were outside of his field, and they promised to build cottages on them. Once started, he had other cottage lots to sell, and by 1896, we hear that he sold the remainder of his property to another cottage lot developer. It was also around this time that people started conceiving of the idea of summer colonies being built, such as at Pemaquid Point and Long Cove. The other angle, of course, was the push for investors to build new hotels. At the beginning of 1887, people were starting to wonder what would happen at Fish Point now that the Pogey factory had closed. One letter to the editor suggested that the property could be bought at a bargain and that someone could establish either a canning factory there or else clean it up and build a hotel there. The following fall, a group of local men banded together to establish the Pemaquid Beach Company, the Pemaquid Beach Land Company, and purchase the property. Their plan was, as suggested, to clean up the property, tear down the buildings, and sell off the equipment in order to sell it, hopefully, to a hotel investor. We know that they did, in fact, tear down the old factory and sold off the equipment, but unfortunately, a hotel investor never did step forward, and 3 years later, in 1891, the group ended up selling the property back to a Pogey processor, who ran a new factory there for a short time. The return to Pogey processing at the site was a particular disappointment to those who wished to promote tourism, since Pogey processing created a terrible smell. When the processing was about to return to the site, one article in the Messenger tried optimistically to assure folks that there were new methods that greatly reduced the stench and that it would not deter the tourists. Also in the fall of 1887, there was quite a bit of excitement when it was announced in the paper that the hotelier Robert Haynes, who owned the finely kept Coburn House in Skowhegan, had bought John's Island and planned to build a large hotel there. The following February, in '88, we hear that Haynes was in town making arrangements to start construction on the hotel that April. It'll be but a few weeks, this is from an excerpt from the paper, it'll be but a few weeks before spring will be at hand, and then you may look for a boom in Pemaquid. In a private letter from Mr. R.W. Haynes, he says, quote, "I shall be at Pemaquid in April to commence work on my hotel and to help you boom old Pemaquid," unquote. Mr. Haynes is full of push and energy, backed by a large experience in the hotel business, and his purchase of John's Island means a hotel that Bristol will be proud of and conducted in a manner that will draw hundreds of visitors to old historic Pemaquid. Unfortunately, it appears that within 2 months' time, Haynes must have changed his mind. 4 years later, in 1892, he still owned the property and hadn't built a hotel, and editor Lewis states in the paper that the town should be making more of an effort to convince Haynes of John's Island's potential for a hotel. I can't help wondering if Haynes' hesitation had anything to do with the Pogey factory across the bay. But disappointments aside, there was also some successful development in 1888 when 2 new hotels were built and began being advertised in the Messenger. One was the Ocean View House, built on New Harbor Hill by Than Hanna, which supposedly could house 75 guests. The other was the Hotel Pemaquid, a bit larger, built by J.E. Nichols. While development continued at a slow but steady pace, William, ever the promoter of Bristol, continued to advocate for the future potential of tourism. In August 1891, William included this little item that appeared in the Rockland Courier-Gazette. Quote, "There are families living in Bar Harbor, it is said, who spend $15,000 in a season. This is the sort of item that makes an average Maine man smile from ear to ear." The editor then adds his own comment, and also proves how false is the argument made by many that the summer visitors are no benefit, that they leave no money in a place during their stay. Bristol hasn't been fortunate enough to secure any of the $15,000 ones, but she has the attractions that will bring them here in time. As we've seen, Lewis was not just a talker, but played an active role when it came to attracting business to Bristol. In 1893, as a way to promote both tourism and industry, Lewis joined with several other men of the area to lead an effort to get an electric railroad built from Newcastle down to the end of Pemaquid Point. The group sent a petition to the state legislature, and less than 2 months later, on April 13th, Lewis was able to print a copy of a state-approved charter for building the railroad. The only catch was that the project needed to find investors and start construction within 2 years, or the charter would become void. As you know, the railroad was never built, but it certainly wasn't from a lack of trying. We can tell from the pages of the Messenger that Lewis was tireless in his efforts to sell stock in the railroad, both to local residents, asking them to invest in the future of their town, and also bringing in investors from out of town. He even hired a hydraulic engineer to examine the potential water power of the Pemaquid River, since 1, the railroad would need electricity to run, and 2, potential investors might be more enthusiastic if they believed that the area could support both tourism and manufacturing. In March of '94, Lewis reported on the favorable findings of the engineer and wrote, quote, "He is estimating on constructing a dam and canals that will give 1,200 horsepower, which will be sufficient for the electric plant and numerous good-sized manufacturing plants." Later, Lewis wrote about the arrival of potential investors coming from Boston and even as far away as Iowa. But eventually, time ran out. The charter expired in 1885, and it was a great disappointment to many. So much happened on the tourism front during the years that the Messenger was published that I can't even begin to relate it all. But there's one more big event that's worth mentioning before the paper stopped being published in 1897. In 1896, there was a lot of excitement over news that a new hotel was going to be built in Pemaquid Harbor. Almost weekly, there was a short report given of the progress being made on its construction. One week, we hear that the lumber's been delivered. Another week, that the contractor's been chosen. Then a report about how quickly the building was going up. Another week, we hear that the painters have arrived. And finally, that the furnishings were being delivered. Finally, a name was chosen and announced. It was to be called the Edgemere Hotel, the first grand hotel to be built on the Pemaquid Peninsula, and one that would surely help Pemaquid become a real resort destination. In May, as the hotel is about to open, a long front page article appeared and began this way. It has been said for years that what Pemaquid needs is better hotel accommodations to bring her to the front as a summer resort. At last, the great need is to be supplied, and people can find accommodations here where they can enjoy the beautiful scenery and gain health and strength from the invigorating breezes wafted from the ocean, or from the gentle zephyrs laden with the perfume of the fields and woods. Pemaquid can lay claim to many attractions of which other places cannot boast, and she has nearly all of them which have made other places famous. The article went on to give a detailed description of the hotel's dimensions and interior floor plan, which is interesting to have since, unfortunately, like so many hotels of that era, it burned to the ground in the early 1900s. And by the way, this is the only photo the OBHS has of the Edgemere Hotel. So if anybody has more photos, please share them with us. Okay, we're moving on in the we're moving on in the outline. At this point, I'd like to turn to the story of the newspaper itself and William Lewis's efforts to keep it running. William Lewis bought a number of job presses as well as a newspaper press as soon as he took over the paper. He doesn't mention the model of that first newspaper press, but the following October, he boasted the following: 1,500 copies of the Messenger are printed this week, besides a large amount of job work. Not being able yet to purchase a larger press or to put in steam, this all has to be done by foot power. So if the Messenger does come to you one day late, do not find fault. So we know at least that his first press was powered by a treadle mechanism. At the end of 1887, William revealed big plans for the Messenger. In December, he announced that the Messenger building was going to be expanded with a good-sized wing on the north end. And in January 1888, he says that he's planning to buy a Shipman steam engine, which will cost $800. I'm not sure why he backed out of buying the Shipman engine, but it was probably because he decided it would be a better idea to invest in his first cylinder press. In April, he announced the purchase of an Acme cylinder press, which we later learn was run by a hand crank. With the new cylinder press, William was able to enlarge the size of the newspaper and increase the number of columns from 5 to 6. Unfortunately, the Acme press turned out to be a lemon, and within a month had broken down completely. Although William was refunded the price of the press, he still lost quite a bit of money from transportation costs and had to apologize to his subscribers for missing 2 weeks without a paper. So, by necessity, William had to buy a new press quickly, and this time he bought not only a cylinder press, but also a steam engine to run it. He reports, "The press, which is a Potter drum cylinder and a 2-horsepower Payne engine and boiler, which we purchased in Portland, arrived on the Enterprise Saturday and are now in running order, and we trust that the Messenger will reach you regularly hereafter, as we find that the little engine is a much more certain power than manpower." The, quote, circular work of the office has never agreed with our frail constitution, and turning a crank for 2 or 3 hours is not conducive of brilliant editorials, which are supposed to originate in the brain of a country editor. Here are a couple slides showing that new equipment. There's the 2-horsepower boiler and engine, and there's the Potter press. But William wasn't done with his improvements. That same year, in September '88, he announced that he would be raising the roof of the Messenger building in order to create a new second-floor hall that would be leased to the Red Men organization. Here's the full picture of the Messenger building, showing both the northern extension that was mentioned earlier and the new raised roof. But of course, all of this took money, and William had a constant struggle to keep the paper afloat. From the beginning, selling subscriptions was a top priority. Subscribers were sought not only within Bristol and Lincoln County, but the Messenger also employed an agent, A.B. Tookie, to travel all over Maine and even to Boston, selling subscriptions and advertising space. Locals were also encouraged to send subscriptions to their friends and relatives who had moved away for jobs. One tactic for increasing the circulation was to hold multiple contests over the years, offering nice prizes, such as a fancy chamber set, to those readers who could bring in the greatest number of new subscribers. In terms of circulation, the Messenger actually did quite well. For example, while the Booth Bay Register, under B.T. Cox's 12-year run, only grew to a circulation of around 800, the Messenger more than doubled that number in its 11-year run, with a final circulation of around 2,000. But the money coming in from subscriptions wasn't nearly enough to pay the monthly bills and make needed improvements to the paper. When the new Acme press failed in April of '88, deed research shows that William resorted to borrowing $500 from his mother by mortgaging his share of the Messenger lot, which they'd bought together, and other pieces of property that they owned in common. The following December, on the very same day that that particular mortgage was discharged, William, together with his mother, mortgaged the whole of the Messenger lot, including the printing equipment, to a local friend and investor, John Yates, for $800 in cash. By the following April, now 1889, William felt compelled to announce that he would be raising the cost of a subscription from $1 a year to $1.50 a year. There must have been complaints about the proposed 50% raise in price, since the deadline passed without any action taken, and instead, the following August, the price was raised to a more reasonable $1.25. Just a month later, however, in September of '89, William made a really big move and announced that the Messenger was going to be turned into a stock company. In October, the Pemaquid Publishing Company was organized, with William Lewis listed as treasurer and secretary, as well as its publisher. Then began an effort to sell around $3,000 worth of stock at a cost of $5 a share, encouraging readers who really cared about keeping a newspaper in Bristol to invest. By the following summer of 1890, William was able to announce that the company had 60 stockholders and that $2,300 worth of stock had been purchased, with only $600 worth more to sell. The paper also stated that that year's investors had actually received a 7% dividend. But behind the scenes, the finances still weren't doing well. In 1889, after paying off their first mortgage to John Yates, William and his mother took out a second mortgage with him for $600. And then in 1892, William again mortgages his shares to his mother for $640. But one of the biggest problems that Lewis had was collecting money from his subscribers. Despite his many pleas over the years for people to pay their bills, in October 1894, William reported that the paper was owed over $1,800 by subscribers. By November, he'd probably had enough, and he announced in the paper a possible merger with the Damariscotta Herald, which fell through. Then in December, he again reported that the total amount of unpaid subscriptions had risen to over $2,000. One can hear the frustration in Lewis's normally chipper voice as he announced that he would be taking legal action against each and every subscriber who didn't pay their back bills. It is a small town. It's really hard to navigate these things. Later, the editor reported that he had to take action against very few people. But in January 1896, the beginning of the paper's last full year, we see William again trying to put his foot down, saying that absolutely no paper would be sent out without payment in advance, not even to his friends. The paper also dropped the employ of its traveling agent, whose fee was 25 cents out of every $1.25 subscription that he sold. The final 31 issues of the Messenger are missing, with one exception. The next to the last issue, dated March 18, 1897. It's interesting to see that there's absolutely no hint within its pages that the following week would be the paper's final issue. In fact, the paper still appeared to be trying to attract new advertisers by boasting about its circulation as the largest circulation of any paper in the Lincoln County. And it was also still trying to attract new subscribers with special deals, such as this appeal to the ladies, where a subscription to the fashion magazine Modes would be included with their $1.25 subscription to the Messenger. Let's see. I wish that we had the final issue of the Messenger, if only for William Lewis's final editorial. However, a little bit of it is preserved in the Damariscotta Herald's announcement the following week about the consolidation of the two newspapers. The last number of the Pemaquid Messenger was issued last week, and the subscription list has been turned over to the Damariscotta Herald. In his closing article, Brother Lewis truthfully says, quote, "Lincoln County has had too many papers for the amount of business." He says, in addition, the Messenger and Damariscotta Herald have covered practically the same field, a field in reality large enough for but one, and that one ought to receive a good support. 3 years ago, the consolidation of the two papers was contemplated, but the deal was not consummated. For the past 3 months, negotiations have been pending, looking to the uniting of the two, and I now announce that the consolidation has been completed, and from this date, the Pemaquid Messenger as a distinct paper ceases to exist and is merged in the Damariscotta Herald, which paper will carry out all of the Messenger's subscriptions, unquote. The News wishes Brother Lewis success in whatever new field he may find for his labors. So we learned that Lewis had actually been in talks with the Damariscotta Herald for the past 3 months. Now, finally, William was free of the Messenger and of all the stress of trying to find money to keep it going. But I suspect that he had some ambivalent feelings about the consolidation, since he had clearly poured his heart and soul into the paper and had firmly believed in it as a vehicle to promote the interests of the town at a time when the town really needed promoters. Within weeks after the paper folded in March, here's the postscript. Within weeks after the paper folded in March, Lewis moved his family, including his mother and sister, to Cherryfield, Maine, where by July he had started a brand new newspaper, the Narragansett Times, and later started the Jonesport Enterprise. While back in Bristol, John Yates was foreclosing on the Messenger lot. Finally, 8 years after moving to Cherryfield, William Lewis quit the newspaper business altogether and moved his family to Malden, Massachusetts, where he spent the rest of his career selling real estate. When the Messenger folded, it was certainly a big loss to the town, but also to us who learned so much from its pages. But in my opinion, it was an even bigger loss to the town when William Lewis, one of Bristol's most industrious citizens, left Bristol. In conclusion, I leave you with this one last slide, which lists some of the roles that William Lewis filled during the 11 years he was also editor of the Messenger. Thank you. And I came in at an hour. Usually I go over. I'd be happy to take some questions. If anyone has any? Yeah.
You said the paper was sent out. Is that how it was delivered?
It was mailed.
Mailed.
Yep.
It was postmaster for Pemaquid.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Mark.
Where was the hotel in Pemaquid? The Edgemere, I think you said was the name.
Oh, it's down in Pemaquid Harbor, right across from the fort.
Across from the fort.
Yeah, you can't see it now. It's all grown in.
Fitch's house is there now. David Fitch lives there at the site of the Pemaquid Hotel.
And it's still named Edgemere.
There's an Edgemere Lane or something, yeah. Anna.
Is the newspaper available for us to look at?
We have 100, whatever I said, we do have copies at the History Center. If you want to make an appointment, that would be good. Yeah.
But the
Well-
other copies are in.
Maine Historical Society in Portland. I have to say, all of these copies of the Messenger are really, really fragile. And I'm talking with the Maine Historical Society to try to brainstorm how we might get them digitized, like the Lincoln County News, both ours and theirs, because they kind of complement each other. And I'm hopeful they'll have a lot more resources to look into grants and things, but this is it. I mean, these are such incredible resources for things happening in Bristol at the time. Yeah.
Where's Pemaquid Falls?
Well, it's where the OBHS and the mill is. Yeah, and then if you go up Harrington Road, that was the community of, if you just go up Harrington Road a little bit, Fir Hollow Road is on the right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Anything else?
Great job.
Belinda, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.